Deep in the black forests of the nation we refer to today as Yugoslavia, but long before that land was even called the Kingdom of Serbs, there was a war for territory among the barbarians and the civilized kingdoms that left the landscape dotted with battlegrounds and forts. Most of these forts were abandoned or integrated into cities once the fighting was done. One fort, in particular, nestled in a broad clearing deep within the forest, drew the attention of a group of settlers. Now, this fort wasn't the largest by any means, but it was still a good deal larger than most. The walls were made of old timbers, and the buildings within it mostly collapsed. That being said, the watchtowers were still sturdy, and for the small community taking up residence, there was plenty of space for growing crops just outside the walls. This fort, and the meadow it was nestled in, sat less than 5 miles from a major road, and another, larger town stood just outside the forest. Settlers moved in, repaired the gates, and built themselves a thriving and largely self-sustaining bucolic community within the walls of the old fort. Though the threat of another barbarian incursion kept the villagers on watch, the forest remained peaceful for nearly a full generation. Nearly. One night, one of the village's best hunters was taking his allotted time in the fort's northernmost watchtower, the one adjacent to the front gate and with the best view of the meadow the forest encircled. Leaning back in his seat, he was nearly asleep when an unusual sound pierced his mental fog and drew him awake. He heard screaming. Now, as small and tightly knit as the village was, legitimate crime was extremely rare. In fact, the town only had one stockade cell, and that usually held the village drunk. To the drunk's credit, he was very old, and was actually one of the original founders who deserted the military to settle the village. Any other crime was typically handled very swiftly by the mayor and the appointed town marshal. None of this mattered at the moment, since a moment later the hunter realized that the screaming was coming not from the village, but from the forest beyond. For a moment, it was a shrill, echoing cry. Next, it was a deep wail that seemed to come from every direction at once. The hunter raised his lantern and peered out over the meadow and into the forest. When at last he located the source of the awful shrieking, the haggard woman was already barreling down the path towards the village gates. These gates were open, of course. They had no real reason to shut them. Nevertheless, the hunter sighed and climbed down from the tower to see what was the matter, as he was on watch after all. There were only just over 100 people in the village, and the hunter knew them all by name. The woman flying down the path, however, was a stranger to him. By the time he reached the bottom of the tower, he could see that he was not the only one who had emerged to take a look. The marshal was already fully dressed and trying to calm the stranger, as the abbot emerged from the church and seemed to be moving to do the same. The strange woman looked as if she hadn't slept in days. Dressed in tattered clothes she must have been wearing for at least that long. Now that the hunter was near, he could clearly hear the woman's inane ranting. "Demons in the forest, monsters in the dark," she wailed. "Beasts that hunger and bite and tear. They come, they come." On and on she went about being pursued, impending doom, the price of blood. By now the stranger's screeching must have woken nearly the entire village, and if the residents hadn't already emerged from their doorways to investigate, they were at least watching from their windows. In an attempt to return the strange woman to reason, the marshal asked the hunter if he and a few other village men would take lanterns outside the walls and have a look around. It all felt a bit silly, but the hunter complied, rounding up a few other village hunters, several of them still in their night clothes, and making his way out the gate through the chilly blackness of the meadow to the edge of the dark forest beyond. For several minutes, the men idled about, shining their lanterns here and there. Eventually, when nothing but a night breeze revealed itself, the men collectively laughed at the stranger's rants, some silently, some aloud, and at their own nervousness at her words. They turned their backs to the shades between the trees. It was then that those shades surged forward in frenzied masses of black hair, sickening yellow eyes, and tearing fangs that soon dripped red. The Screams of the savaged men blended with those of the stranger as she broke away from the abbot to try and close the village gates. The marshal moved to stop her, since he could see that the hunter had broken free from the melee and was sprinting back towards them. A moment later, though, one of the beasts slammed into him from behind and tore him open like a straw doll. The mayor bellowed an order from the doorway of his house, and the horrified stupor gave way to a panicked rush to shut the old timbers against the monstrous creatures outside. The beasts made no attempt to pursue them, though. They were sated by the flesh of the hunter and his men. The sounds of tearing meat and massive footfalls could still be heard throughout the entire meadow. Hours passed this way, in a sort of daze. Mothers sheltered their children, husbands sheltered their wives. Nobody slept. Through it all, the marshal, the mayor, the abbot, and the stranger watched the shadows from the tower. Some hours before dawn, the ripping sounds ceased, but were replaced by an arguably worse series of sounds. The quiet scratching of claws against timber, testing the walls, prying at the gates, searching for any crack or fault, searching for a way in. As the sun rose through the morning fog, the shapes returned to the trees, and a dense, uneasy silence settled over the meadow. At daybreak proper, the marshal and the abbot left the village to see the dead return to their families for burial. However, as they neared the tree line, all they found were scraps of clothing, dried blood, and hair. Even the few bones left behind had been cracked open and the marrow licked out. A rustle and a brief glimpse of yellow eyes between the trees told the two men that the monsters were still here. With the state of their remains were in, the pair decided to leave them where they were, rather than burden the villagers with such a gruesome sight. When the two men returned to the village, they found most of the villagers gathered loosely around the mayor in a communal mourning. Off to one side, the haggard old woman, the stranger, stood preaching ruin again. Most cast only disgusted, backwards glances her way, but a few stopped and listened, the concerned looks on their faces before walking quickly away. The marshal, and by extension the mayor, insisted everyone remain inside the village walls for the next few days. It was harvest season, and the farmers of the village grumbled about potentially losing crops to pests, but they ultimately obeyed. That night, the beasts emerged again, scratching and scraping at the walls that separated them from the villagers. They returned the next night too, staying even into the morning to circle the village walls. Each day, they stayed outside the walls a little longer into the day. If these were wolves, they were larger and more powerfully built than any wolves the villagers had ever seen. Most believed that this was all they were, large, hungry wolves. A few disagreed. Days turned into weeks. The town's supplies and patience began to dwindle. It was near impossible to sleep at night with the ever-present scratching, only ever drowned out by the stranger's morbid sermons. Finally, a group of farmers had had enough, decided to venture outside their walls and harvest their crops regardless of the beasts. The haggard strangers shouted at them as they marched out the gate, screaming that the beasts were unsatisfied and were walking to their deaths. In broad daylight this time, the villagers heard the awful screams of the men torn apart. The stranger cursed the men's refusal to heed her warning, and as she left the gate to go back to her preaching, a few villagers followed her. With provisions running short and the village living in constant fear, the mayor called a meeting to discuss what could be done. Here, the marshal and 4 brave villagers presented their plan to make their way through the forest to the main road and get help from the town just beyond the trees. The stranger and her small but vocal group of followers objected, claiming it was suicide to leave the safety of the walls. But the marshal insisted, reminding the assembly that these were probably just wolves. They likely would not bother them if they left now. What was left unsaid, but not unnoticed, was the reason the beasts may ignore them for now. It was because they had just been fed. In the end, the mayor sided with the marshal, and his group left the village and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Another week passed. The threat of starvation had now become very real. Many of the villagers had lost faith in the marshal's expedition, and more people were joining the stranger's followers. 2 days before the last of the food would have run out, the mayor called another meeting and asked the entire village for any possible solutions. And the stranger had one. A sacrifice, she proposed. 3 villagers to be thrown over the wall to feed the beasts. While they were busy gorging themselves on the bodies, the farmers and gatherers could emerge and safely gather food for the village. The abbot rose up in an outroar, much of the village master's tone. Accusations were thrown at the stranger of murder, witchcraft, and heresy. When at last the mobs on both sides had finished their shouting and the room was silent, the mayor, gaunt and weary, called for a vote. A slim majority emerged. A lottery was agreed upon with the condition that none below the age of 12 were to participate. 3 lots were drawn. As each name was called, the villagers, starving and desperate as they were, would surge around the unlucky chosen and drag them, fighting and screaming like a cornered animal, to the wall. And so the first villagers were thrown to the wolves. The first was lucky, breaking his neck on impact. He died quickly. The second fractured her spine as she tumbled to the earth, and would be unable to feel the tearing and ripping as the beasts ate her lower half. The third landed on the first 2, breaking only his ankle. He stood and tried to flee, but even uninjured, he would never have had a chance outrunning the monstrous creatures. As the screaming died down and the bodies were dragged into the trees, the gatherers emerged from the gates, led proudly by the stranger. When they returned, their arms and baskets were full of food, enough to last the village for a few days at least. The villagers sighed in relief, some cheered, celebrating the stranger's thinking. Others, like the abbot, seethed. This would be the first time the abbot directly accused the stranger of being a witch, of being in league with the devil. Why else could the stranger have known that a sacrifice would appease the beasts? Why else would the beasts have arrived only after the stranger entered the gates? He claimed the beasts were demons, under the stranger's control, used to frighten the village into obedience to her ways. Some were swayed by the abbot's fiery words, but others clung still more tightly to their new priestess, who claimed the abbot simply feared an empty church. Not that any of their words mattered. What mattered was that the stranger's plan had borne fruit, pushed away the slow clawing of starvation. So the cycle continued. Every few days, when supplies ran low, the mayor would draw and read 3 names. A few took the fall willingly, but most struggled. The impact killed some, maimed others. Some tried to run, some begged at the foot of the wall to be let back in. The bodies of those who took their own lives were likewise thrown to the beast. It went on like this for weeks. The stranger's following grew with each successful sacrifice, while the abbot and his followers looked on in indignation. The more villagers died, the easier it was to feed those remaining, an ever-shrinking cycle. Until one particular morning. During one lottery, on the second draw, the mayor hesitated a moment before reading off the name of the stranger. Everything grew still for several moments as the meaning of the words the mayor had spoken sank in. And then the village square exploded into a riot. The stranger's followers stormed the mayor's position, overturning the lottery box and sifting through the names. Fraud, trickery, cowardice, corruption, they cried. The names of the mayor and his wife were both missing from the pile. The abbot tried to call for cool heads, but even many of his own supporters were outraged by this betrayal. How many of the other lotteries had been rigged? How many had been cast over the wall unfairly? How many had the mayor marked for death? No. Intervening now would have meant death for the abbot too. There would be no trial. And the penalty was obvious. The mayor, his wife, and their son were all 3 dragged to the wall and thrown down to be torn apart by the beasts. This was the first time a child had been sacrificed, and it served as a brutal precedent. With both the marshal and the mayor now gone, it was decided the only way to settle on who would be cast out was through a public vote, and the village cheered for their new democracy. The very first to be chosen was the old drunk, the village's last surviving founder. He'd been sober since the village had been besieged, and withdrawal had him bedridden. They dragged him out bodily. When his young granddaughter tried to intervene, she was dragged away too. Good riddance, the villagers cried. A useless mouth isn't worth feeding. And for a couple of weeks, this is how it was decided. The weak and the sick were cast out alongside anyone who could not work. If you were not able-bodied, it was only a matter of time before your name was called. Those villagers that survived the culling gathered themselves into two major voting parties: the abbot's faithful and the stranger's witnesses. Both factions struggled for control, neither remained innocent. Murder, blackmail, intimidation were common tactics for both sides as they desperately tried to achieve the majority they needed to vote out the other side's leader. Neutrality was a death sentence. In truth, neither the abbot nor the stranger had much control over their followers anymore. They'd reverted to a brutal sort of mob mentality. They did whatever they believed was best, and all in their leader's name. Family members turned on one another. Infidelity and cannibalism were rampant. The only thing that mattered was the lottery. This Cold War lasted for some weeks. Of course, until one morning. When the last of the votes had been counted, both the abbot and the stranger had been selected to be cast over the wall. The fuse had reached its inevitable end. The village square exploded into extreme and tumultuous violence. The bloodshed quickly engulfed everything inside the walls. Fires ignited and spread. They would likely have swallowed everything if the rain hadn't come. The vicious battle lasted for 6 days. Family and friends painted their homes in each other's blood. The dead and unfortunate were thrown over the wall. Neighbors fought and killed each other like animals in the streets. It was a close and personal battle. Knives, makeshift spears, farming implements, stones, often their bare hands. When the bloodbath finally ended, only 22 of the original 118 villagers remained. 22 and the stranger. When dawn broke, the abbot, with his good hand, he'd lost the fingers on his other to the teeth of a good friend, and his faithful dragged the stranger, bloody and filthy, kicking and screaming, up onto the wall and cast her over. The bodies cushioned her fall. More flesh and blood than the beasts could ever have eaten. And after extracting herself from the reeking pile, the stranger swore venomously at the abbot atop the wall, and then wandered slowly away, through the morning fog blanketing the meadow back into the forest. Nobody actually expected the stranger to be eaten. By now, most of the survivors had come to accept the abbot's accusation that she was indeed some form of witch. A few surviving members of the witnesses believed that, without the stranger, the village was now lost. The rest just prayed that they could find another way to deal with the beasts. The raging fires of the battle had left the gates damaged and exposed. The survivors stood watch that night, with their makeshift weapons at the ready, to fight and die rather than keep hiding. But the beast never came. 2 more days and nights passed with no sign that the beast had ever been there. It was like they'd just vanished. It wasn't until the dawn of the 4th day that a commotion from the trees drew the survivors back into readiness. But what emerged from the forest was no monster. It was the marshal, leading a caravan of heavily armed men. As the party approached, the survivors let their weapons fall from their blood-stained hands. Several collapsed. Others wept. The abbot stepped forward to welcome the marshal and explain what had occurred. When the story had been told, the abbot asked why it had taken the marshal so long to return. Most had thought him dead. The marshal told him that upon reaching the town outside the forest, he'd found it in a similar state to their own village. The marshal then traveled on for some time in hopes of finding help, when he finally met with the caravan that he had brought back. These men were bounty hunters. They'd been on the stranger's trail for some months now. However, they'd never been able to get too close to her, as she seemed to be followed closely by a pack of monstrous wolves wherever she went. The abbot at last felt himself vindicated. At last it was clear that the stranger was a witch, an agent of the devil aided and protected by demons. The bounty hunters laughed at that. They assured the abbot that the beasts were in fact just simple animals, if a bit large. Bounty hunters had even managed to kill a few of the wolves that had lagged too far behind the pack. The abbot couldn't understand. If the stranger wasn't a witch, then why did the wolves follow her so? The bounty hunters grew quiet for a moment. It was for the same reason that the wolves had grown so large. Wherever the stranger went, the wolves knew they could have their fill of human flesh.